In January 1975, editors and senior reporters from the New York Times gathered inside the White House for what was supposed to be a routine Q&A. But things got interesting fast. The topic turned to the CIA and a mysterious collection of reports known as the Family Jewels. Would the public ever see them? President Gerald Ford didn't mince words. He looked the reporter straight in the eye and said if those files ever got out, even redacted, they would blacken the eye of every president since Truman. They could destroy America's image abroad. Well, that was all the bait the reporters needed. What exactly had the CIA been up to? Assassination, and that's off the record. The room fell silent. It was too late. Off the record or not, the secret was out. The CIA had allegedly been involved in killing foreign leaders, and it was only the beginning. Hold on to your tinfoil hats. We're taking a deep dive into the murky world of the CIA in today's episode of The Infographics Show. The mid-70s weren't a good time for the CIA. It was on the verge of imploding, thanks to a number of scandals and a 693-page internal report known as the Family Jewels. Within those pages were admissions of illegal wiretapping, surveillance of American activists and journalists, assassination plots against world leaders, and mind-blowing Nazi-esque human experimentation. The document offered a glimpse into the murky depths of CIA operations, with the worst of it conveniently left out. Meanwhile, Washington was still reeling from the political earthquake of Watergate. President Richard Nixon had dragged the CIA straight into the scandal, weaponizing the agency to sabotage and smear his opponents. That abuse of power led to the now infamous break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters inside the Watergate complex. Nixon wasn't the first president to bend the rules, but he was the one who got caught. And sometimes that's all that matters. On June 23, 1972, Nixon got on the phone with CIA Director Richard Helms, the man who knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically and literally. The contents of that conversation were later made public by Supreme Court order in what became known as the Smoking Gun Tape. With the Watergate scandal just beginning to unfold, Nixon and Helms engaged in what Politico later described as gangsterly dialogue. Nixon seemingly threatened to blow the lid off the JFK assassination if Helms didn't help him get out of the very tight squeeze he was in. Nixon talked about the CIA's dirty tricks. He was referring to the U.S.'s support of death squads and dictators, to regime change. He also referred to hanky-panky, generally thought to have meant secret assassinations. This is what the CIA called health alteration, executive action, and termination with extreme prejudice. Looking for leverage, Nixon confronted CIA Director Richard Helms with a loaded question: who shot John? A thinly veiled reference to JFK's assassination. Then he drove home the point: is Eisenhower to blame? Is Johnson to blame? Is Kennedy to blame? Is Nixon to blame? The CIA had a lot of skeletons in its closet, and Nixon knew it. He was issuing a warning: if I go down, you go down. And then he told Helms, I have done more than my share of lying to protect you, and I believe it's totally right to do it. What did Nixon know, and what was he threatening to leak? It doesn't prove the CIA had anything to do with JFK's assassination, but it is certainly interesting. It's also evidence that the CIA was indeed dirty. So, when Ford replaced Nixon, the CIA, and by extension the US government, had a lot of image cleaning to do. Presidential aide and political behemoth Henry Kissinger told the new president that the CIA's clearly illegal actions would raise profound moral questions. The most shocking actions, he said, if they all came out, the CIA would be destroyed. Ford called a secret meeting with his chief of staff, Donald Rumsfeld, and his deputy chief, Dick Cheney, to devise a plan of action. That's what led to the White House luncheon and subsequent moral outrage all across America and the rest of the world. The congressional investigations that followed, led by Senator Frank Church, would reveal the CIA had conducted over 900 major projects and several thousand smaller projects, with 75% of them never being reviewed outside of the agency. As former President Kennedy had warned, the CIA was out of control. Church described them as a rogue elephant whose actions were often minimized or ignored by a pliant media. But was the CIA being made a scapegoat for the president and other powerful elements of what journalists today sometimes call the deep state? Congressman Otis Pike of the House Select Committee thought so. He explained, the CIA does not go galloping off conducting operations by itself without approval from higher up the line. He added, the CIA never did anything the White House didn't want. Running the world's most powerful country and attaining global supremacy was never going to be a wholly democratic process. But as a so-called beacon of liberty, the U.S. had to keep up appearances. Still, President Harry Truman, who signed off on the National Security Act of 1947 that created the CIA, didn't intend to create a monster. It was never intended to be a cloak and dagger outfit. The agency, Truman believed, should keep the president informed on global affairs, not running covert wars in the dark. But as Pulitzer Prize-winning author Tim Weiner put it in Legacy of Ashes, Truman's vision was subverted from the start, and that subversion began with the CIA's roots planted firmly in the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. When the OSS was shut down after World War II, its most powerful minds didn't just fade off into retirement. They resurfaced as the CIA's founding elite. Amongst them were Frank Wisner, a brilliant yet ruthless strategist, and Allen Dulles. Dulles would one day become the CIA's most controversial boss. He was the man who had once protected a wealthy Nazi businessman and a major war criminal, SS General Karl Wolff, the go-between for Hitler and Himmler. Wolff, who would later be accused of sending 300,000 Jews to Nazi extermination camps, was just one of the high-ranking Nazis secretly shielded from the noose at the Nuremberg trials. Why? Well, because it served U.S. interests. But this wasn't exactly something you could tell the public. So, fascists in Europe were secretly supported by the U.S. to sabotage the communists. This resulted in one of the CIA's most secretive operations, Operation Bloodstone. Wisner enlisted European anti-communist refugees, and in some cases former Nazis, for what he said would be psychological warfare, subversion, sabotage, and assassination. Some were offered up the carrot of, do your job, and you can come live in the USA. Many were already living in those communist nations, but that didn't stop Wisner's team from launching covert missions. For years, they parachuted into countries like Albania, Poland, and Ukraine, aiming to cause trouble and form a resistance. It sounded daring on paper, but in reality, it was a disaster. Most operatives gathered little useful intelligence. Many were captured. Some disappeared entirely, others turned out to be double agents, and this was all thanks to the Soviet moles embedded in British intelligence. The toll of these sabotage missions was likely one of the reasons for Wisner's mental breakdown and death in 1965. Under the similarly covert Operation Gladio, CIA and NATO-backed anti-communist paramilitary forces would later be accused of terrorism, bombings, false flag attacks, and political assassinations across Europe. These stay-behind armies, often made up of far-right extremists and ex-fascists, were implicated in torture and massacres that continued long after the war. All of these operations needed millions in covert funding, money that was secretly laundered from the Marshall Plan. All added up, it was about $685 million, around 5% of the total Marshall Plan funds. So, the CIA hired some very nasty men, including high-ranking Nazi intelligence specialists. One of them was Alois Brunner, an Austrian SS captain who was a major component of the Holocaust. He sent tens of thousands of European Jews to the extermination camps, including women and children. He was a torturer who caused people untold pain and would become one of the most sought-after Nazi war criminals. And yet, he was given a pass by U.S. intelligence. He admitted long after the war that he was given papers by U.S. officials. He said that he worked as a driver for the U.S. Army and later fled to Egypt, where he rented a room from a nice Jewish couple who, according to the New York Times, he said were quite nice people, really. The reason he was protected was because he was working for the highly secretive Gellen organization, which was headed by top Nazi intelligence officer Reinhard Gellen. Known as Hitler's super spy, Gellen had been in charge of Nazi intelligence on the Eastern Front, making him a prize asset for the CIA. On September 20, 1945, Gellen was smuggled out of Germany on a plane headed for Washington, D.C. To save his skin, Gellen agreed to work for Uncle Sam, but this came with requests. He wanted his men from the war, other high-ranking Nazis, thugs, torturers, and executioners whose intelligence work for the U.S. was later said to be mediocre as best. Then there was Otto von Bolschwing, the man who was responsible for expropriating Jewish property during the war. Yet, in the 1960s and 70s, he was enjoying a corporate career in the USA, surrounded by neighbors in the affluent suburbs. They had no idea that this guy who served them up barbecued frankfurters had once hanged people from meat hooks. He was behind 1941's Legionnaires' Rebellion and Bucharest pogrom, when the Jews were taken from the streets in Romania and tortured. Their homes set on fire, their synagogues burned to the ground. Some were forced to write letters saying goodbye to their loved ones and then shot in the head. In the most disturbing story involving von Bolschwing, on January 23rd, a large group of Jews were taken to a slaughterhouse where they were tortured and shot, men, women, and children. When their bodies were found, someone had stuck a sign to some of them that read, "Kosher." After being granted U.S. citizenship in 1959, Von Bolschwing became wealthy from working with large corporations, later landing a job with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. The CIA helped to whitewash his past, but his past eventually caught up with him. The Office of Special Investigation would have him deported, but he was so ill that he died in a hospital in California in 1982, age 72. The CIA could do whatever it wanted. The senior operations officer Tom Braden later admitted as much, saying it could hire armies, it could buy banks. There was simply no limit to the money that it could spend, and no limit to the people it could hire, and no limit to the activities. Part of that endless stream of money went toward what Frank Wisner proudly called his mighty Wurlitzer, a super-secretive program designed to propagandize Americans and turn Eastern Europeans against communism. Wisner was behind the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a CIA-funded radio station that provided pro-West, anti-Soviet content to communist satellite states. He was also behind the hydrogen balloons that floated high above the Iron Curtain and dropped propaganda leaflets on the people below. They dropped over 590,000 balloons that carried 301 million leaflets, posters, or books over the Iron Curtain to Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. This was done under the cover of plausible deniability. None of it could ever be traced back to the US government. It was, after all, major political influence. But not all of that propaganda came in the form of leaflets and loudspeakers. Sometimes it was much more subtle. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was a seemingly innocent intellectual movement that drew in peace-loving minds like Tennessee Williams, John Dewey, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and Bertrand Russell. But what none of them realized was that they had unknowingly become part of a global anti-communist propaganda machine secretly run by the CIA. The CIA led operations in which certain books would be smuggled into the Soviet Union, a project that lasted throughout the Cold War. It's thought that about 10 million books got through. One of the reasons why so many Russians read the works of George Orwell, the British journalist and novelist who wrote the famous book about totalitarianism, 1984. Orwell was also a critic of imperialism and was often skeptical of left-right politics, but it seems the CIA wasn't interested in nuance. They liked the fact that he was scathing when it came to Soviet communism, so they made sure that one of his most critical communism-based works, Animal Farm, was smuggled into Russia en masse. Spreading the anti-communist message in Eastern Europe was one thing, but selling it at home in the US took a different strategy. Sure, much of America already viewed communism as a threat, but a growing anti-imperialist movement was starting to push back. Books like War is a Racket, 1935, written by the highly decorated Marine General Smedley Butler, were fueling the fire. And with lines like, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism," his words hit hard. This kind of rhetoric didn't sit well with the CIA, especially when it secretly orchestrated coups in Iran and Guatemala, toppling democracies in favor of US-friendly regimes. To cover their tracks and polish the image of those new puppet governments, the agency needed more than just boots on the ground. And this is where Wisner's Operation Mockingbird came in. It certainly didn't hurt that Henry Luce, the owner of Time and Life magazine, was close friends with C.D. Jackson, president of the CIA front known as the Free Europe Committee. According to Rolling Stone journalist Carl Bernstein, one of the first to expose Operation Mockingbird, Jackson wasn't just an ally, he was Luce's personal emissary to the CIA. Journalists in the US and some worldwide wrote stories at the behest of the CIA, or at least had their stories approved by the agency. Without psychological warfare, the rest of the work would have been impossible. The CIA had a habit of silencing critics, especially those who dared to expose America's darker dealings abroad. And in 1963, it faced a major headache. A book was about to hit the shelves, The Invisible Government by journalists David Wise and Thomas B. Ross. The authors pulled no punches. They exposed the CIA's role in engineering coups in Iran and Guatemala, replacing democratically elected leaders with dictators. The authors claimed that the so-called freedom-loving institutions of the US government were just a smokescreen for a covert empire fueled by dirty wars and secret deals. They also pointed fingers at the CIA for masterminding the catastrophic Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba and for supporting violent operations in Vietnam, Laos, and Indonesia, conflicts that collectively killed millions of civilians. The CIA director at the time, John McCone, called the writers in for a meeting and talked to Random House, saying that there were parts of the book that must be deleted. Publishers Random House refused, so the CIA went to Plan 2. It said it would buy every single copy itself, to which Random House said that it would just print a second edition. Today, the invisible government is considered the first serious deep dive into the CIA's covert operations, shattering the carefully crafted image of America as always the good guy. For many, it was the first time that they saw past the patriotic propaganda and glimpsed the secretive agency operating behind the scenes. Little did the writers of that book know that the CIA promoted art exhibits, symphonies, ballet, theater, jazz, and opera. If the work was seen as being pro-US, its gloved hands were everywhere, including in Hollywood movies, one of the major sources of pro-US propaganda. Declassified letters show that C.D. Jackson was in regular contact with Carlton Alsop, a CIA officer who worked undercover at Paramount Studios. He was following in the footsteps of his father, Joseph Alsop, a journalist and columnist for The Washington Post, who was also a covert CIA asset and operative. In the letters, Carlton was told by Jackson to write certain narratives into movies. In the film The Caddy, Jackson suggested planting spectators in the crowd watching a golf game. He said these spectators needed to be black, and that's because the left of American politics, as well as many African Americans, were saying that blacks weren't being treated on equal terms in the US. The CIA wanted to make it look like they were. Even today, critics believe the CIA sometimes plants seeds in movies to help the public think a certain way, and it's not always about foreign policy. We now know, thanks to the U.S.'s Freedom of Information Act, the CIA over the years influenced a number of scripts to ensure the U.S. and the CIA were portrayed positively. According to research by the Age of Information, the Pentagon and the CIA together have, quote, worked behind the scenes on over 800 major movies and more than 1,000 TV titles. This has included making script changes in the James Bond franchise, the Transformers franchise, as well as Marvel and DC universes. Surprisingly, the CIA and Pentagon also had input in the America's Got Talent TV show, Oprah, and various documentaries by the BBC, PBS, and the History Channel. Not so surprisingly, it had a hand in writing of Homeland, The Americans, Zero Dark 30, Argo, and Black Hawk Down. In the 90s, it even had a go at creating its own show, The Classified Files of the CIA. However, the pilot was called a masterclass in humorless propaganda. The movie propaganda thing started with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1953, he said in a secret letter, "The hand of government must be carefully concealed," explaining that there would be arrangements with all sorts of privately operated enterprises in the field of entertainment, dramatics, music, and so on. This was par for the course in dictatorships in China or the Soviet Union, but it wasn't really supposed to be part of a democracy. Big Hollywood blockbusters tended not to show the grim reality of U.S. foreign policy back then. Even small criticisms have been expunged from films by either the CIA or the Pentagon, such as when a CIA torture manual had to be taken out of Meet the Parents. The CIA's Allen Dulles was a huge James Bond fan, and he knew that by telling stories that made the intelligence work look cool, it would influence the world's public. Indeed, Dulles had a special relationship with Bond's creator, Ian Fleming. In declassified letters, it was revealed the CIA had developed 007-style gadgets similar to those used in the many failed attempts to take out Cuban leader Fidel Castro. In these secret communications, Dulles put pressure on Fleming to portray the CIA in a positive light. But maybe one of the most startling instances of censorship was in the movie The Hulk. This was when the code name of a military operation was changed from Ranch Hand to Angry Man. The reason being, the former was the name for a real covert operation. It was a U.S. military campaign during the Vietnam War that dumped millions of gallons of toxic chemicals like Agent Orange across Vietnam and Laos. The aftermath was catastrophic. Farmland was destroyed, ecosystems were poisoned, and according to the Vietnamese government, an estimated 400,000 civilians were killed. The CIA pushed the story that the death and destruction from Agent Orange was Soviet propaganda. It wasn't. As for Laos, the CIA ran a secret war there, dropping more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos during 580,000 bombing missions, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in world history. The agency trained Hmong people to fight, and with Air America, its secret airline, turned a blind eye to or gained black money from heroin trafficking. The CIA secretly sponsored or subsidized over 1,000 books that were published and circulated in the U.S. under the direction of E. Howard Hunt, one of the men behind the Watergate break-in. The agency also recruited writers from mainstream outlets to pen glowing or damning reviews depending on what narrative they wanted to push. Hunt allegedly ordered a New York Times writer to slam Edgar Snow's book on China for being too soft on the communist regime. Incidentally, on his deathbed, Hunt made a series of shocking recorded confessions to his sons, implicating himself and others in a conspiracy to assassinate JFK. He even drew a diagram explaining how it all went down. Some called it a cash grab, others claimed it was the truth finally coming to light. The LA Times called it inconclusive, but it definitely left people talking. Still, it was a funky time for conspiracy theorists, and as you'll soon see, they had a lot of ammunition. The CIA was never a big fan of alternative JFK assassination theories, which is why on April 1, 1967, Director Richard Helms secretly launched a campaign to smear critics of the Warren Commission report using friendly U.S. journalists and editors. James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence czar, established a secret group to spy on New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, the man who was questioning the Warren Commission's findings. Declassified documents show that Angleton called this his Garrison Group. CIA Memorandum 1035-960 went out to all CIA station chiefs, said to use propaganda assets in the media to discredit Garrison and other troublesome characters, trying to say anything other than Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Some media subsequently called Garrison an egomaniac, a KGB asset, or on the payroll of the mafia. It's not certain if this was CIA influenced, but it is certainly plausible. The CIA even had a man inside Garrison's team. His name was Gordon Novel, who was reported to have been Garrison's chief of security, while at that same time working for the White House to destabilize Garrison's operation. This kind of thing hardly inspired confidence in the Warren Commission report. One of the reasons the House Select Committee on Assassinations later said that there was probably a conspiracy to kill JFK, but it didn't finger the CIA. Then there was the U.S. Attorney Mark Lane, whose JFK assassination book Rush to Judgment became a bestseller and kicked off decades of skepticism. He said most media wasn't interested in the story, and publishers snubbed his work. He had no idea why. Through Freedom of Information requests, he discovered both the CIA and the FBI had put pressure on publishers to ignore him. He eventually went to a British publisher. The book exploded, and Lane was a marked man. FBI agents went to his lectures and forwarded their reports to the Warren Commission. Some journalists refused to work with the CIA, such as Wayne Phillips of the New York Times, who said that he was offered $5,000 a year to write friendly narratives. The deal didn't go through because of complications. That was less than Keys Beach of the Chicago Daily News, who was offered $12,000 a year, about $120,000 in today's money. Propaganda was incredibly important, but it wasn't enough. The CIA needed to be more hands-on at home in the USA, which fell under the domestic spying program Operation Chaos. The agency reportedly illegally spied on 7,200 Americans, with about 300,000 civilians and 1,000 groups in its index. This included journalists, civil rights groups, women's liberation groups, socialists, communists, and anti-war groups. The agency had a large file on Martin Luther King, who became a major critic not just of racism, but of poverty and imperialism. He was really only deemed a serious threat once he'd branched out from civil rights, which was when even left-wing media started criticizing him. In a declassified memo, a CIA officer talks about King being assassinated, stating that this would be problematic because it might make him a martyr. He was right. Years later, the House Select Committee on Assassination said that there was likely a conspiracy in King's actual assassination, but it didn't believe it included the FBI or CIA. What the CIA might have liked to have done is modify King's behavior, and it just so happens the agency tried to do that to Americans without their consent. This brings us to mind control. In European safe houses and across Asia, powerful drugs were tested on people in an attempt to brainwash them, but the CIA wanted to bring the program home and test on what one memo called the weaker or less intelligent members of society. The infamous memos, the ones that surfaced after the CIA took the unprecedented step to destroy every single document concerned with MKUltra, contain lies about making a person commit an assassination or sabotage against their natural will. But could you make someone do something terrible and then make it so they couldn't remember anything? Or could you plant false memories? Documents showed this was a major pillar of the MKUltra agenda. One of the men hired to make this possible was Louis Jolyon Jolly West. West became well known as one of the psychiatrists sent to visit Jack Ruby in prison after he had shot Lee Harvey Oswald. West was the first person to declare Ruby delusional and psychotic, rendering anything Ruby said the words of a madman. This was strange, according to the journalist Tom O'Neill. Strange because O'Neill found documents showing that Ruby was fine prior to West's visit. West said Ruby had an acute psychotic break and was now positively insane, which he said was unshakable and fixed. Psychiatrists have since said that it's unusual for a sane 52-year-old man with no history of serious mental illness to completely lose his mind overnight. Well, unless powerful drugs weren't involved. In a sworn affidavit, West said that Ruby believed all Jews in the U.S. would be slaughtered and Ruby's name was at the top of the list. West then claimed that Ruby hid under a table thinking that they were after him in the jail. According to O'Neill's book, Ruby claimed that he could hear the screams of his brother outside, who was being tortured in the street. Ruby believed that this pogrom was ordered by Washington. This came after half a dozen other psychiatrists had found Ruby to be sane, so the judge wasn't sold on West's diagnosis. According to O'Neill, the judge was also suspicious that West had been sending applications to treat Ruby for a long time. The judge ordered a second opinion, having himself spoken to Ruby numerous times and seen no signs of insanity. Ruby's jailer, Sheriff Bill Drecker, said the same. So, Dr. William Beavers went to visit Ruby. He was surprised by what he saw. Ruby did seem to be hallucinating, and he was definitely paranoid. Rabbi Silverman said the same after Ruby told him to duck underneath the table, adding, "They're pouring oil on Jews and setting them on fire." Still, Dr. Beavers wondered how a sane man could suddenly become so crazy. He told the judge that toxic psychosis should not be ruled out, meaning that he might have been drugged. He thought it unlikely, but then he didn't know the truth about Jolly West. No one did, except the CIA. West specialized in driving men insane. West became known for treating U.S. soldiers who came back from the Korean War, saying that the U.S. had dropped biological weapons. They were snitching. The CIA believed that powerful drugs had been used on these men and that they had been brainwashed. The U.S. media quickly ran with it, pushing the idea that the Chinese forces were using advanced psychological tactics to turn people into loyal communists. That's why some captured U.S. soldiers had decided they wanted to stay in China rather than come home. We now know the Chinese hadn't used drugs or any other special torture techniques, nothing other than the usual sleep deprivation. Brainwashing was bunk. No secret weapon to control the human mind existed, wrote the New York Times. But according to Mr. West, it wasn't bunk. After the Korean prisoner controversy, West was chief of psychiatric services at the 3700th USAF Hospital at the Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. In 1953, he secretly became part of MK-Ultra, working under its chief, the CIA's Sidney Gottlieb. He had denied this all his life, but it is a known fact. Under the top-secret Subproject 43, he was tasked with trying to induce madness and plant false memories in people using drugs and hypnosis. He later wrote on a paper stating that with drugs and hypnosis he could replace true memories with false ones. Years later, West ran a secret crash pad in the Haight-Ashbury area of San Francisco, where he later got some of his assistants to dress up as hippies and persuade people off the street to visit the pad. There, West also dressed up, plied them with LSD, and took notes on their behavior. When the CIA and MK-Ultra were investigated in the 70s, the agency provided the Senate with documents regarding West's work. Most of them, as per usual, were heavily redacted, but what is mind-blowing is that they'd taken out West's biggest accomplishment, the part where he said he's successfully been able to replace, quote, the memory of a definite event in the life of an individual with a fictitious one. For years, the CIA had been obsessed with cracking the code of mind control. It was one of the main goals behind MKUltra, and yet, when the program finally came to light, the agency claimed it was a failure. Nothing worked. West's name was redacted during the investigations, but the CIA swore under testimony that the 5 pages of documents it presented to Congress were everything on the planting of false memories experiments. That was a lie. Buried in the National Security Archives is the original 14-page summary by West. In it, West claimed he had successfully planted false memories in human subjects and also created a trance that can be produced in given subjects. The CIA's shortened and manipulated summary that states manifestations of dissociative states has never been studied was also an outright lie. The evidence shows West did that for many years. West's other work on inducing hypnotic trances with what he called new drugs was celebrated in the Oregon Journal, in which he said the most important contribution of the drug LSD so far is in producing model mental illnesses. He could make people go mad. Nonetheless, West always denied that he'd been on the CIA payroll, once stating, "I have never taken part in mind control experiments funded by the CIA or anyone else." In 1972, still pretending not to be a CIA asset, He tried to open a new lab at the disused Nike missile base in Santa Monica. He called it the Center for the Study of the Reduction of Violence. He wanted to study human violence by conducting tests on prisoners. The lab was controversial, with a federal investigation revealing West was planning to study behavior modification using, quote, coercive methods that threatened privacy and self-determination. But West's connection to mind control traces back even earlier. Around midnight on July 3, 1954, Sherry Jo Horton vanished near Lackland Air Force Base, where West just happened to be working at the time. Her parents had left her playing in a park and then she was gone. As search parties scoured the area, panic mounted. Then came the shouting. Two construction workers had just tackled a man, Jimmy Shaver. He was dazed, drenched in blood, and according to witnesses, seemed to be in a trance-like state as if on some kind of drug. Shaver had no idea how he had gotten there. He didn't know where he was, he didn't even know who he was, and he certainly couldn't explain the blood. He didn't have a history of mental illness or alcohol or drug use. He hadn't ever been charged with violent crimes, and now he was covered in blood and had scratches on his face. Soon, the search party found the body of Sherry in a gravel pit nearby. She had been viciously attacked. Deputies arrested Jimmy Shaver, and it was the first time he'd ever been in trouble with the law. On paper, he didn't fit the profile of a brutal criminal. He was weeks away from getting remarried. He had 2 young children. He was a model citizen, a good worker in his job as a technical instructor at Lackland Air Force Base. In jail, he was interviewed by military officers who said that he wasn't drunk, but he didn't seem normal. Later, when police investigators interrogated him, Shaver's wife turned up and he didn't even know who she was. He was still in some kind of trance. 2 months later, West was called to determine if Shaver had been legally sane when he committed the crime. West used a so-called truth serum, sodium pentothal, on Shaver in an attempt to get past the amnesia. West said that Shaver was then able to talk about the crime in detail, as well as discuss abuse during his childhood. He'd apparently been repressing these memories. Long before the murder, Shaver was one of West's patients at the Air Force Base where he'd been treated for severe migraines. At the time, Shaver's superiors had recommended that he join a new experimental trial. The trial was led by none other than West. When O'Neill went to look at the records of this trial at Lackland, curiously, they were all in order, but for some reason the files under SA to ST were missing. O'Neill also examined the interview transcripts from West's interviews with Shaver, but the middle section was also missing. It skipped from Shaver denying involvement in the crime to West saying, "Shavers is crying, he's been confronted with all the facts repeatedly." Shaver apparently went from denial to confession, but we don't know how. During the trial, a news reporter who had no idea about MKUltra or West's secret work said Shaver sat through the strenuous sessions like a man in a trance. In 1958, age 33, he died in the electric chair. We also now have the declassified letters West wrote to Gottlieb, which indeed said that he was working with drugs and hypnosis. One of them clearly said that he was using techniques for implanting false information into particular subjects or for inducing specific mental disorders. He said that he hoped to create couriers who could carry a long and complex message. West added that all of this must eventually be put to the test in practical trials in the field, and he asked for some sort of carte blanche. The letters say that he needed guinea pigs, which he said could include prisoners in the local stockade. And if West were to induce, quote, specific mental disorders in people, it would be good if he could use patients who already had mental issues. This was the same time Shavers was his patient. Gottlieb replied, thanking him for being such a good asset, saying that West was exactly what we were after. Okay, now get ready to hear about the CIA's other specialty, assassinations. In 1957, during the Suez Crisis, foreign policy officials met at the house of the journalist Walter Lippmann. CIA boss Allen Dulles was in attendance. Someone brought up the problem of Egypt's anti-imperialist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and joked about finding an assassin. But for Dulles, it was no laughing matter. With complete seriousness, he responded, "Well, first you would need a fanatic, a man who would be willing to kill himself if he were caught." This response was in line with the CIA's now declassified assassination manual, but for all of those there that day, they were in shock. Dulles had told them that the assassin would have to be an outsider, an Arab, but getting the right man would be difficult. For Dulles and his brother John to exert power on the world, you had to smash heads, but you had to make it look respectable. This all sounds unbelievable, but not if you read the works of the CIA whistleblower Philip Agee. He's very important as far as CIA Cold War secrecy is involved. His tell-all book about CIA training and fieldwork in Latin America from 1957 to 1968 remains one of the most detailed exposés on the agency ever published, and it's likely we will never see anything like it again. In 1982, the Intelligence Identities Protection Act made it a serious federal crime to reveal the identities of CIA operatives, something that this author did without hesitation. Agee was huge, with the Washington Post once saying that he was arguably more damning than anything WikiLeaks has produced. Agee said the CIA was behind, quote, military coups, torture chambers, and terrorism, and this had the backing of powerful multinational corporations and local elites. These helped push millions to the edge of starvation and often beyond. He called the CIA the Gestapo and SS of our time. He said that leftist students, workers, and political activists were continually assassinated all over Latin America by military dictatorships who he said had the backing of the CIA and the US government. So, you might wonder, why didn't the CIA just kill him? Maybe they tried. The Washington Post's intelligence editor Jeff Stein once wrote, "For the rest of his life, Agee was a target of CIA assassination threats." In a New York Times article, the writer opined that the CIA had never forgiven Agee, following him around the world and planting seeds that he was connected to the KGB. The agency even got him kicked out of Britain, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, hoping that he'd have to go to the Soviet Union, which would fit with the KGB narrative. Agee was subjected to a phony drug bust in Spain, and maybe even an assassination attempt. Agee tried to find out, but a federal judge refused to open secret documents about him, saying they described illegal acts against him that would endanger U.S. national security. The article said that it was likely these illegal acts that helped Agee avoid being tried under the U.S.'s espionage laws. The CIA had shot itself in the foot, and it liked shooting things. This brings us to one of the CIA's most shadowy creations, the Special Group, a covert unit with a very specific purpose. You'll hear a lot of different names for these kinds of operations, but they'll all boil down to the same thing: direct action. We're talking about ambushes, sabotage, election meddling, black propaganda, and targeted assassinations. Sometimes the mission was noble, taking out actual terrorists, but other times these operations targeted leftist activists, political reformers, and anyone seen as a threat to U.S. interests, especially in poorer countries. The word assassination wasn't used in any documents, with the Senate committee later saying the CIA used secrecy, compartmentation, circumlocution, and the avoidance of clear responsibility, so it always had plausible deniability. It's rare that you'll find smoking guns with the CIA, so most of the time, we must rely on circumstantial evidence, and even then, the agency issues denial after denial. The Senate committee said the CIA and high-ranking U.S. politicians often spoke in riddles, but they did talk about neutralizing certain political leaders, such as when they discussed eliminating the progressive Iraqi Prime Minister, General Qasem. The CIA has never admitted to his subsequent overthrow and assassination, but there is evidence which points in that direction. The CIA's Health Alteration Committee certainly talked about killing him, or who they called a high-ranking member of his government, once agreeing to send him a poisoned handkerchief. Instead, it's likely the agency helped his enemies kill him, which was way more common and much less risky than using your own people. As you might know, the Special Group also planned to murder Fidel Castro, as well as Che Guevara. Also on the hit list in Latin America was the once golden boy of U.S. power in the region, the murderous, corrupt dictator Rafael Trujillo. The only failed mission was Castro, but it wasn't as if they didn't try. Under Operation Mongoose, they thought about poisoning his cigar and giving him an exploding seashell, but all attempts, maybe 8, maybe many more, failed. You know this already, so let's talk about Guevara. He watched Latin American tyrants rule over nations while U.S. corporations got rich, which is how he became radicalized. People lived and died under these tyrants, and any kind of leftist activism was violently quashed, often with covert U.S. help. Guevara quickly became an enemy of the USA. For that reason, he had to go. Let's just add here that despite the romantic view of him, like the communist leaders he supported, he was a murderer. He punished desertion among his rebel fighters with death. He lined up his enemies against a wall and shot them. He had men tortured and hanged, which he said in his journal was sad but instructive. He called the judicial process in such times an archaic bourgeois detail, which he said had no place in revolution. Again, fighting monsters had created a monster, the seemingly endless vicious cycle of violence in global politics. On January 30, 1960, the special group met and talked about plans to assassinate Guevara. According to the book Surprise, Kill, Vanish: The Secret History of CIA Paramilitary Armies, Operators, and Assassins, the State Department subsequently put aside $4.4 million to kill Guevara, Castro, and his younger brother Raul. Ironically, Fidel Castro lived until he was 90, and Raul is still alive today, aged 94. Maybe it's true, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Allen Dulles wasn't keen on the plan to assassinate the men. He wanted to use an exile army to invade Cuba and force a coup. He believed that he could do a repeat of Guatemala and Iran. The American people, of course, had no idea any of this was going on. They would learn in time that Dulles' plan, the Bay of Pigs invasion, was an embarrassing failure. Dulles had hoped that JFK would send in the troops, but he didn't. He just got mad at Dulles, and Americans also didn't know that the CIA was making use of thousands of Cuban refugees in Florida. Under the secret JM Wave project, they gathered assets and trained them for the invasion, some of them even working with the CIA-friendly parts of the mafia. One of the refugees was Felix Rodriguez. He was born to an elite family in Cuba, his uncle serving under the hard-right murderous tyrant Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a tyrant who had happily worked with the American mafia and U.S. multinationalists. Fidel Castro and Guevara got in the way of this, upsetting the U.S. in the process when they defeated Batista's forces in the Cuban Revolution. In 1960, Rodriguez was about to start university in Miami when a strange man approached him. In 2017, he wrote, "I had no idea I was being recruited by the CIA." He was about to become a part of the CIA's super covert killing program. One day, he and other men were flown on a C-54 aircraft with blacked-out windows and taken to Guatemala, where training began in earnest. They learned hand-to-hand combat, pistol shooting, explosives, and jungle survival techniques. After 4 months, Rodriguez told his superiors he had a better idea. What if he assassinated Castro? That would be better than an invasion. He later wrote, "The CIA took me up on the idea." Meanwhile, for reasons that haven't been made abundantly clear, Rodriguez's group, Brigade 2506, trained not just for the invasion but also the assassination of Trujillo. Trujillo was a monster. He ruthlessly tortured his enemies and fed them to the sharks. But he'd also been a good friend for the U.S. The media talked about him as a modernizer and a benevolent strongman, and according to Time magazine, a force of order. Still, his utter brutality and the carnage he caused couldn't stay hidden, later making him a liability for his friends in the U.S. The State Department's Henry Dearborn later admitted to being the man who liaised between the local assassins and the CIA, sometimes passing messages in rolled-up cigars. The CIA sent him machine guns, which he handed off to the assassins. But he wasn't told everything, so the U.S. government could always claim plausible deniability. It was a success. Trujillo was gunned down on May 30, 1961, an ambush-type hit the CIA would later deny having any part in. Back to Rodriguez, the Bay of Pigs was a disaster, and he never got his chance to hit Castro himself. JFK was furious, thinking that he'd been misled by Allen Dulles, who he later fired, and then Kennedy further annoyed the CIA by creating Title 50 and National Security Directive 10/2. This put any covert paramilitary operations under the control of the DoD, with the CIA only playing a supporting role. He later promised to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. The CIA also backed a coup in Vietnam, where the Diem brothers, who had been supported by the U.S., were given early retirement. On November 1, 1963, the CIA's Lucien Conine, who was working with the plotters, made a call and said the coup was about to happen. President Diem's palace was soon overrun as citizens went inside and ran off with vases and expensive whiskey. He and his brother were soon holed up in a church, and they both agreed not to cause any more trouble during the power transfer to the military general, Duong Van Minh. They were both picked up by American jeeps and armored vehicles, and somewhere along the way, they were both executed in the back. We later learned the CIA had supported the assassins for the coup. The agency might not have ordered the hit, but it certainly didn't try to stop it. We now know that the CIA and its powerful friends planned to escalate the war in Vietnam, but the Diem brothers and Kennedy stood in their way. But not for long, Kennedy was assassinated 20 days later, and a false flag attack on U.S. ships paved the way for a full invasion. In June 1967, Rodriguez was in Miami when he got a call from his CIA case officer. The man said, "Are you willing to go to Bolivia and lead a mission?" It required unconventional warfare skills. He said yes, and he asked what the mission was. He was told that he was to train Bolivian army rangers and get Che Guevara. So Rodriguez got on a plane with a special forces team to go and find and kill a murderous man who'd one day become a pop political icon. While Guevara was in the mountains at a village called La Guerra, Rodriguez received a radio message that said, "Papa cansado," Dad is tired. This was code. Rodriguez's loyal Bolivian henchmen had captured the revolutionary. President Lyndon Johnson soon received the message that a Bolivian unit trained by the U.S. had got Guevara, but it added, "It is not yet confirmed." Rodriguez and a Bolivian army colonel flew by helicopter to a schoolhouse in the mountains where Guevara was being held. He was on the floor, his wrists and feet tied. Rodriguez sent a message to the CIA station in La Paz confirming that they had their man. They even had Guevara's diary and address book, an intelligence jackpot. Rodriguez looked Guevara in the eye and told him he'd executed a lot of his friends after they had been captured in the Bay of Pigs. Rodriguez told him he was CIA and that the CIA wanted him alive. At the same time, shots were fired in rooms nearby. Guevara's men were being executed. Rodriguez then received the coded message 500 and 600, which was the order to kill. He later said despite what Guevara had done, this was not within the laws of the government world. Well, that's his story. He was a trained assassin who lied for a living. Still, Rodriguez had always maintained that the Bolivians had control of the operation, not the CIA. This is questionable given the might of the US power in the region. To most researchers, it's absurd. Also, the BBC said Rodriguez gave the order but was supposed to make it look like he'd been shot in action. Not killing him was leaving a hero to many who could rally the leftist world in a trial. Health alteration was cleaner and less complicated. Whatever the case, Guevara was going to die, which is what the CIA had always planned. Rodriguez walked out of the room to the sound of gunshots. A few minutes later, he saw soldiers walking away with Guevara's Rolex watch. The order was given to cut off his hands and send them to Cuba, to Castro, where they remain to this day in a secure facility. They are occasionally brought out for revolutionaries to look at to see for themselves what Cuban leaders call CIA and American brutality. But despite what it says on the t-shirts, Guevara was a cold-blooded killer. As for Rodriguez, he was later assigned to the Phoenix program in Vietnam, where the U.S. was secretly torturing and assassinating tens of thousands of its mostly non-combatant enemies. In 1955, the CIA might have had a part in blowing up Air India Flight 300, killing 16 and injuring 3 more. Mao Zedong's right-hand man, Premier of State Zhou En-lai, was supposed to be on that flight, but he missed it. The hit was blamed on the Kuomintang, or KMT, a Chinese nationalist group, but we now know from declassified documents that the CIA had plans to assassinate En-lai, which included poisoning his rice with one of Sidney Gottlieb's killing potions. The CIA and the KMT were thick as thieves, who they trained, equipped, did covert operations with, and if you believe the critics, did some narcotics trafficking with. So, is it possible the CIA was involved in bringing down that plane? We'll let you decide. When it comes to the theories, the best one concerns France and an attempted coup and later assassination attempt against the stubborn leader and outspoken critic of U.S. imperialism, Charles de Gaulle. Despite being the voice of the resistance during the war and later forming the Fifth Republic, a lot of people wanted this man dead. It's believed there were 30 assassination attempts against him, and some were secretly supported by the CIA. L. Fletcher Prouty, a former U.S. Air Force liaison to the CIA, said at the very least the CIA condoned those murderous acts. De Gaulle really rubbed the U.S. the wrong way after he took France out of NATO in 1966 and consistently voiced his objections to imperialism. He went as far as to say the D-Day landings were an attempt by the U.S. and the U.K. to settle France, which he said they saw as enemy territory. He shocked the U.S. to its very core when he called it an occupying state interfering in all economic, military, and political processes in the world. He used what you might call fighting words when he said, U.S. imperialism leaves no field unoccupied. It takes every form, but the dollar is the most insidious. His nationalist and anti-hegemonic worldview called for détente with the Soviet Union, with a tripolar planet and a Europe of nations where the U.S. would have less power over trade and military matters. He was also against the Vietnam War, and he made sure that U.S. troops were pushed off French bases. In short, he was a great big thorn in the USA's plan for world domination. The agency, which still had connections to spies and assassins in far right-wing groups in France, left over from Operation Gladio, put him under constant surveillance. The U.S. Embassy was crawling with CIA, and de Gaulle knew it, even if he couldn't prove it. And then came the coup attempt in 1961. De Gaulle had said he was going to give Algeria its independence and stop the war there. He supported African countries' push for self-determination, which the US and its friends had sometimes done everything to stop, including the 1961 assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the Republic of Congo's first democratically elected prime minister. Still, there were about 1 million French people living in Algeria, and it seemed to some like de Gaulle was abandoning them. The right-wing ultranationalists now viewed him as a traitor, so the French generals over there took control. World War II hero General Maurice Chalais announced on the radio that de Gaulle's government was one of capitulation and he was taking a stand so the French people in the war had not died for nothing. Importantly though, 75% of the French people had voted for Algerian self-determination just months earlier. De Gaulle had told his inner circle that the generals were collaborating with the CIA, which wanted him gone. Shaw had been a NATO commander, so of course he shared the US's dislike of de Gaulle. Soon the French press was calling the coup a part CIA job, which spread to newspapers all over the world. French publications talked about how the CIA's top spy and Bay of Pigs boss, Richard Bissell, had been seen having dinner with a member of the anti-de Gaulle terrorist outfit known as the Secret Army Organization. This far-right paramilitary group that over the years would be responsible for bombings, assassinations, sabotage, torture, and massacres, despised de Gaulle. De Gaulle had blamed the CIA for having supported hard-right thugs in Operation Gladio. As the coup attempt had the world watching in anticipation, over in the US, the Washington Post said that General Shaw only went ahead with the coup because he was convinced he had unqualified American support. He did not from the president JFK. But Dulles denied the U.S. connection, saying any rumors that the CIA was involved were completely false. He blamed the Soviets for spreading such evil rumors. The New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent C.L. Sulzberger backed Dulles in an article that sounded like it came from a CIA press release. He wrote that the U.S. government had always acted with discretion, wisdom, and propriety, which he said was the case with all government departments, including the CIA. Years later, when journalist Carl Bernstein released his Operation Mockingbird exposé, interviewed CIA officials said Sulzberger was a CIA asset. He denied it, but a CIA official said that Sulzberger loved to cooperate. It ran in the family. His uncle, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the former publisher of the New York Times, was later revealed to be a CIA asset. Declassified documents show that during the CIA-led overthrow of Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz, in 1954, Sulzberger withdrew the newspaper's correspondent from the country, limiting American public knowledge of the coup. He even wrote a letter to CIA Director Allen Dulles, who at the time sat on the board of and had shares in the United Fruit Company, the U.S. corporation whose monopoly in Guatemala had been threatened by Arbenz's land reforms. After Arbenz was removed and the CIA helped install a vicious military dictator, United Fruit's power was restored. Other journalists disagreed with Sulzberger, writing that the CIA had gone rogue too many times, which echoed what the U.S. President John Kennedy was thinking. Kennedy, who had been misled by Dulles before, believed the CIA was involved, according to the French government sources. It was well known that Dulles hated de Gaulle, and not just because of NATO in Vietnam. De Gaulle had once said that the stay-behind fascists, spooks, and criminals backed by the CIA in France were dangerous for the security of France. After Dulles flew out to France and met with de Gaulle, he reportedly returned to Washington secretly talking about replacing him. JFK then made a public announcement saying, "In this grave hour for France, I want you to know of my continuing friendship and support, as well as that of the American people." De Gaulle didn't need the help. He addressed his nation on TV, declaring it the duty of every French citizen to protect France from these traitors. Tens of millions of French people took to the streets, shouting their support, screaming the words "Fascism will not pass." Some screamed anti-US chants like "CIA out of our affairs." JFK later phoned Hervé Alphonse, the French ambassador in Washington, and apologetically explained, "The CIA is such a vast and poorly controlled machine that the most unlikely maneuvers might be true." Alphonse later said that Kennedy had even offered to help him get rid of all the U.S. officials in France who'd likely backed the coup. Kennedy told the U.S. ambassador to France to give de Gaulle any help he might want in Algeria or France. De Gaulle declined, calling the offer well-intentioned but inappropriate. He didn't want U.S. soldiers killing French soldiers on French soil, which would not have looked good to the public. Time magazine later talked about how the disgraced Shah landed by airplane in Paris looking like a broken man. Despite JFK's offer, the French people were still crying out in protest over how the CIA had tried to relieve them of their leader. Admiral Pierre Lacoste said outright that the CIA supported the OAS. As Kennedy was already thinking about splintering the CIA into pieces, The French press called the agency a state within a state, which was more fuel to fire up Kennedy's wrath. He had the power, not the CIA, and whoever the CIA was taking orders from. The Gaulle started firing his security officers, the ones close to Dulles, just as JFK was about to fire Dulles. Then in 1962, as de Gaulle was still clearing out suspected CIA friends in his government, he was almost killed. With Algeria newly independent, President Charles de Gaulle was driving down the Avenue de la Libération in his government-issued car. OAS assassin Bastien Thiry gave the signal for the other assassins to open fire on de Gaulle's car. 5 men in cars belonging to the organization's Commando Delta Death Squad lit up the street with submachine guns. 187 bullets were fired in the ambush, but only 14 struck de Gaulle's car. One lodged in the headrest of the passenger seat, inches from where de Gaulle had ducked his head. One of the assassins swung out of a car door, his submachine gun blazing, but somehow de Gaulle wasn't hit. 2 motorcycle officers in his motorcade weren't so lucky. They were killed instantly. The car skidded, the chauffeur spun it around and shot off down the road. The assassins were later imprisoned, and Bastien Thiry became the last Frenchman to be executed by firing squad. De Gaulle later laughed about it, joking, "They are such bad shots." But the fun was over in 1970 when, in his armchair while watching the news on TV, a heart attack finally took him out at the age of 79. So, did the CIA have anything to do with the attempt on de Gaulle's life? We don't know, but the evidence shows the agency and its shadowy overlords in Washington would likely have quietly celebrated had those assassins pulled it off. In 2015, The Guardian in the UK reported that the CIA was indeed asked to help kill de Gaulle, but under President Johnson after Kennedy's demise. The evidence was in files about to be released, and Congress had been told. The CIA had twice been approached after the failed coup and asked by dissidents to help them. The story said an old soldier was to wear a poisoned ring on one of his fingers and shake de Gaulle's hand in what was to be a clasp of lethal friendship. The Chicago Tribune said the documents didn't make it clear if the CIA went any further than entertaining this option or if Johnson was informed. On November 28, 1961, Dulles was given his ceremonial send-off at the brand new CIA HQ in Langley, Virginia. Despite his contempt, Kennedy was outwardly kind, bestowing Dulles with the National Security Medal. J. Edgar Hoover was in the audience, likely wondering where he stood with Kennedy's administration. Nothing was certain for the old guard while JFK was at the helm. Dulles's invite list, the people he'd supported, watched on with pride. This included the CEOs of Chase Manhattan, General Electric, General Motors, Coca-Cola, DuPont, Ford, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, IBM, CBS, and Time Life. He'd made U.S. multinationals a fortune with his neoliberal maneuvering over the years. The doctrine was that money always trickles down on the populace. Maybe it did, but at a great cost to many millions of people a long way from the USA. When it was over, Kennedy flew away in a helicopter. Dulles, watching in the distance, waved, his face forlorn, a beaten man. But he'd be back. He still had power, but he conducted it from the shadows. 2 years later, after Kennedy took a bullet to the head in Texas, Dulles was on the Warren Commission, a move which is now regarded as a clear conflict of interest. The Dulles era at the CIA had come to an end, but the conspiracy's allegations and dark secrets didn't fade. Instead, they erupted into a supernova of suspicion that would shadow the agency for decades to come. Now you should watch CIA leaked documents that shocked the world, or click on this video instead.